Welcome back, everyone. I'm building a game called Where Beasts Were Born. It's an action RPG where your enemy's appearance, abilities, and behaviors evolve over time. In the last devlog, I said that I wasn't happy with the limited amount of tactical options for the players. So my focus since then was to make the gameplay and the interaction between beasts and players more interesting. First of all, I added AI companions and, due to popular request, a dash ability. Then I reworked the targeting system to give players control over which creature parts to attack. I wrote an algorithm that automatically adds points of interest to the generated caves, and I optimized the pathfinding system and the ragdoll system. I also worked on many standard RPG elements like new weapons, experience and leveling up, a heads-up display, first traders, and an inventory system. So there's a ton of things that I could talk about today. But you know me, I like to focus on bigger technical issues and things that make my game unique. So today I'll talk about 4 new core systems. First, I created a new steering system for more diverse movement patterns. Then I wrote a completely new AI system. I added a cave map for more control over the creature evolution. And finally, I want to introduce the new genetics-based magic system. Alright, without further ado, get ready for a deep dive back into the fantastic world of Where Beasts Were Born. Because the creatures and caves are created procedurally, animating and moving creatures has always been a challenge. The original implementation would produce quite unnatural results. This not only looks weird, but also makes the fighting and the interaction with creatures quite difficult and unintuitive. Behind the scenes I used a variant of the A-star pathfinding algorithm to find a path that the first torso segment follows. Each other segment then follows the one in front of it. It's quite similar to how the classic Snake game works. Except it's not. In truth, it's much more complicated because everything is 3D and the torso segments have different heights. If I just let them follow the leader, they would all kind of even out over time, so I need additional logic to maintain the correct height at all times. And of course, the uneven ground and the fact that beasts can climb don't really make things easier. But for simplicity's sake, let's agree I'm basically building a glorified Snake game. There were some issues with this movement system. First, the creatures were locked to the navigation mesh. This leads to creatures choosing similar overlapping paths. It also leads to zigzag movement patterns, and it makes some paths that would actually look more natural impossible. Secondly, when dynamic obstacles appear, the only way to avoid them was to replan a new path dynamically, which is very expensive and looks weird. Thirdly, this system does not allow walking sideways or backwards, and doesn't allow for more interesting movement patterns like jumping. For a while I tried implementing a smarter pathfinding algorithm that finds paths across the triangle faces rather than being locked to the edges. I got pretty far and the results often looked quite cool, but this algorithm requires a definition of what edges are currently visible from a current point, which turned out to be quite difficult to lift from the original 2D algorithm to 3D meshes, and it resulted in a ton of edge cases. So after a few weeks, I gave up. Instead of a more complex pathfinding system, I decided to add a smarter steering system, and I used an algorithm called context-based steering. The idea is simple. Instead of directly following the path, the first torso segments shoot out multiple rays to detect obstacles. If no obstacle is found, the rays are weighted by how much they align with our target direction along the path, and then they are summed up. This gives our movement direction. In case a ray hits something that we want to avoid, the ray is turned into a force in the opposite direction. If we sum everything up again, then the resulting movement direction tends to avoid obstacles. This is all very easy to calculate and extremely effective. Creatures now avoid obstacles and each other. What's even cooler is that I can let larger creatures now walk over obstacles and over other creatures. But I went even further. Because the steerer is no longer locked directly to following a path, I can now also allow the creatures to move backwards and sideways. For this, the steerer simply checks if the ground along the given route is mostly flat, and if so, it moves in this direction. The other torso segments simply try to reach their canonical position relative to the steering segment, which has the effect that creatures straighten back to their original shape if they were rolled up at the beginning of the movement. Using the system, I was also able to implement creature dashing and jumping. The latter means that creatures cannot drop down on you from the ceiling, which I hope will be equal parts awesome and totally horrifying. Another major change is that players are now accompanied by NPCs. The player can switch between characters and the others are controlled by an algorithm called Utility AI. The task of the AI system is to choose which action to perform in the current situation. Fun fact, this kind of system has been used a lot in the Sims series, where characters also need to make similar decisions. Consider this example where we want to calculate what this character should do next. The first step is to find all actions that are currently possible. Here are some examples, but usually there are many more. Then, for each action, we determine a score for how beneficial the action would be in the current situation. Let's start by looking at the attack action here. In practice, we usually split this step into many simple functions. For example, the first such function could look at the distance between the player and the creature and output a value between 0 and 1 depending on how well suited this distance is for a melee attack. Here, we're quite far away, so the result is a low value. Similarly, we may look at the angle between the attacker and the target. We're currently not facing the creature, but we're also not looking in the opposite direction, so this function would give us a score of around halfway between 0 and 1. In the end, this process will give us many partial scores, and these are multiplied to give the final score for this action. This is neat because each of these functions is usually simple and could even be reused for other actions. Lastly, we choose the action with the highest combined score and run it. It gets a bit more complicated when we have actions that only make sense when chained together, or when there's a reason to abort an action. But overall, I think the system works extremely well and is much easier to handle and extend than a large decision tree or other AI systems. What's also neat is that I'll be able to let the players easily configure stances for the AI characters. For example, if the player wants one of their companions to be a ranged fighter, then all I need to do is to set some parameters that slightly alter the scores of some of these functions, and then swapping to a ranged weapon becomes the best choice for this character. I also applied the system to the creatures. Of course, they have different actions available. We calculate subscores in the same way and choose the action with the highest score, so the system works exactly the same. Except for one subtle but important difference. Instead of stances that affect these scores, I use values that are derived from the genetics of a creature. This means that behavior can be inherited. So, for example, if a creature is likely to jump at you, then its descendants are also likely to prefer jump attacks. I'll show some examples of the AI in action later on. But first I want to show two more new systems, but please be aware that these are very much work in progress. Until now I evolved creatures after every cave which the player cleared. So each following cave contained a new, possibly stronger generation. I thought this approach was way too linear and it gives me very little room for balancing. Also, I really enjoy it when games let the player choose how they progress through the world, with their chosen path influencing what they encounter along the way. So the new cave map is more dynamic. In the standard game mode, players will have to try to reach a deep cavern in search of a mystical item or event. The twist is that I evolve creatures only when the player chooses to go further down into lower levels. This gives me a ton of control over player progression. When the game notices that a player is making fast progress and it's too easy for them, I can dynamically spawn less caves on the same level, which forces the player to advance to deeper levels faster. I am really happy with this idea because I already know that balancing this game will be near impossible, and I have some hope that the cave map helps in that regard. If you have other ideas for special caves that the player could find that would influence player progression, let me know. The last new system is perhaps the most unique and coolest of them all. For a long time I struggled with finding a fitting magic system for the game, and I think I have finally found a solution. You see, I've always wanted to go beyond a run-of-the-mill magic system with 4 elements, no obvious energy source, and endless power. I wanted my system to be rooted in the world, to feel heavy and powerful, and to use limited resources. So I thought, what if the spells that the players cast are actually alive? The magic system will be based on angry spirits that the players can find and partially control. Following the main concept of the game, each spirit has its own DNA, which determines its behavior and abilities. They reproduce as long as you keep them submerged in the black flux that is harvested from mushrooms. I plan to build a whole pseudoscience around these spirits with crude chemical instruments that allow you to breed your favorite spirits and mute or enhance individual genes. The idea is partially inspired by the spells in the game Noita, but I want to keep it simpler. For now, I have a basic system in place that lets the spirits reproduce over time. Depending on their genes, they can currently explode on impact, split, or switch targets in mid-air. I'd like to add genes that let the spirit drop to the ground and act like a trap, or one that lets them bait creatures, or one that lets them evolve spikes. I'm still figuring this out. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them. While I concentrated on gameplay, I'm very happy to say that others have made some progress on the game's art. I've had the honor of working with Simon from Monster Garden, who has redesigned the characters and has given them a touch of his unique style and content. I think the style fits perfectly. And what's even cooler is that another artist has already started rebuilding the character models. I'm still in the progress of figuring out animation retargeting, but I really look forward to putting this into the game. So if you see them on Discord, give them a shout out. Now, to end the devlog, I wanted to give you an impression of what the actual gameplay is currently like. So I started recording around an hour or two of gameplay, but I'd like to take a bit more time to cut the footage and add comments. I hope to publish it in the next few weeks. There are some things that already work extremely well, like the cave generation and exploration and the AI system, but there's also a ton of stuff that I still need to figure out. For example, I'm still not really happy with the creature attacks. At the moment it's hard to interpret them, so it's hard to effectively counter them or understand what just hit you. My initial plan was to start releasing small gameplay demos to a select group of friends and then slowly expand this circle throughout this year. But real life as well as various game dev issues keep on getting in the way, and so I still can't make any promises. But with the systems that I've introduced in this devlog, I hope I'll soon be ready to put together a real demo, and in the meantime I hope you'll be back for the first real gameplay footage of Where Beasts Were Born.